Thank you for returning for the third part of Down Styphon by H. Beam Piper. He found Harmacros asleep in one of the village cottages, woke him, and gave him the situation to date. Good. I'll get the men fed. When do you want me to wake you? As soon as you see smoke 2 miles down the valley, as soon as our cavalry from the east begin coming in, and in any case in 2 hours. Then he pulled off his boots and helmet, unbuckled his belt, and lay down in the rest of his armour on the corn-shuck tick Harmacros had vacated, hoping that it had no small inhabitants, or if so, that none of them would move in under his arming doublet. It was comparatively cool in here behind the stone walls and under the thick thatch. The wet heat of his body became a clammy chill. He shifted positions a couple of times, finally deciding that fewer things dug into him if he lay flat on his back. So far, everything had gone nicely. All he was worried about was who would let him down and how badly. If some valiant fool got a rush of honor to the head and charged at the wrong moment. If he could bring this off just half as well as he'd planned it, which would be about par for the course for any battle, he could go to Valhalla when he died and drink at the same table with Richard Coeur de Lion and the Black Prince and Henry of Navarre. A complete success would entitle him to take a salute from Stonewall Jackson. He fell asleep receiving the commendation of George S. Patton, an infantry captain, woke him a little before 10. They're burning Sistros now. That was a town about 2.5 miles away. A couple of the cavalry who've been keeping just in front of them came in. The first batch are about 1,500. There's another lot, maybe 1,000, 2 miles behind them. We don't know where the infantry and the wagons are, but we've been hearing those big bombards at Naza Gap. That would be Clestras's. Infantry on this side, probably supported by Netzigon's ragtag and bobtail from the other side. He pulled on his boots and buckled on his sword, and after eating a bowl of beef stew with plenty of onion in it, he put on his helmet and drank a mug of wine. Somebody brought his horse, and he rode up to the line. On the way, he noticed that the village priest of Dralm and the mobile force priest of Galzar had set up a field hospital on the village common, and that pole and blanket stretchers were being prepared. No anesthetics here and now, though the priests of Galzar used sandbags. He hoped he wouldn't be wounded himself. The last time had been bad enough. A big column of smoke dirtied the sky above Sistros. Silly buggers! The first crowd into it had fired it. Here and now mercenaries were the same as any other, and now the ones behind would have to bypass it. They'd be handling Clestras's army in retail lots. The abatis was finished. Over 100 felled trees ox-dragged into line, butts to the rear and tops to the front. Between them, men sat smoking or eating, or lay on the ground resting. The horse lines were back of the side road, with the more poorly armed militiamen holding horses. At each end of the abatis were 2 of the 4 8-pounders, then an opening big enough for cavalry to sortie out through, and then barricades of farm carts. He could hear a distant, and then not-so-distant, popping of small arms. Far off, one of the bombards at Naza Gap boomed, and after a while, the other. Good, they were still holding out. Cavalry came drifting up the road, some reloading pistols. The shots grew louder, and more cavalry in more of a hurry arrived. Finally, a dozen or so topped the rise across the hollow and galloped down. The last one fired a pistol over his shoulder. By the time he was splashing across the brook, Nostori cavalry appeared, 10 or 15 of them. Immediately an 8-bore rifled musket bellowed from behind the abatis. His horse dance-stepped daintily. Another and another roared. Across the hollow a horse went down kicking, and another just went down. Another, with an empty saddle, trotted down to the stream and stopped to drink. The Nostori turned and galloped back out of sight. Nobody else had fired. Riflemen were a law to themselves, but the arquebusiers were waiting for orders. He was wondering where the rest of the rifles were when a row of white smoke puffs blossomed along the edge of the bench above the creek on the left, and shots banged like a string of firecrackers. There were yells from out of sight across the hollow, and musketoons thumped in reply. Wasting Styphon's good fire seed, 400 yards, they couldn't hit Grant's tomb at that range with smoothbores. Along the abatis, everybody was on his feet, crowding into position. There were a few yells of "Hostigos!" and "Down Styphon!" More confused noise from the dead ground beyond the brow of the other hill, a steady whip-cracking of rifles, fired as fast as they could be reloaded and aimed from the bench. He wished he had 500 rifles up there. Hell, while he was wishing, why not wish for 20 medium tanks and a dozen saber jets? Then the mercenary cavalry came up in a solid front on the brow of the hill, black and orange lance pennons and helmet plumes and scarves, polished breastplates. Lancers all in front, musketoon men behind. A shiver ran along the line as the lancers came down. The advance paused to dress front. As though that had been the signal, which it had been, 6 4-pounders and 4 8-pounders went off as one. Not a noise, but a palpable blow on the ears. His horse started to buck. By the time he had him under control again, the smoke was billowing out over the hollow, and several perfect rings floated up against the blue, and everybody was yelling, "Down, Styphon!" Round shot. He could see the furrows it had ploughed into the block of black and orange cavalry. Men yelling, horses rearing, or down and screaming horribly as only wounded horses can. The charge had stopped briefly before it had started. On either side of him, gun captains were shouting, "Grape shot! Grape shot!" and cannoneers were jumping to their pieces before they had stopped recoiling with double-headed swabs, one end wet to quench lingering powder-bag sparks and the other dry. The charge slid forward in broken chunks, down the dip into the hollow. When they were 20 yards short of the brook, 400 arquebuses blazed. The whole front went down, horses behind tripping over fallen horses in front. The arquebusiers stepped back, drawing the stoppers of their powder flasks with their teeth. Memo, self-measuring spring powder flask, start making them as soon as possible. When they were half reloaded, the other 400 arquebuses crashed. The way those cavalry were jammed, down there, every bullet must have hit something. The smoke was clogging the hollow like spilled cotton now. Through it he could see another wave of cavalry come up on the brow of the hill. A 4-pounder spewed grape into them, and then another. Down Styphon! Before they could begin the descent, another 4-pounder went off. Gustavus Adolphus's 4-pounder crews could load and fire faster than musketeers, a dry lecture-room voice was telling him. Lord Kalvan's weren't doing quite that well, but almost. The first one had fired close on the heels of the third arquebuse volley. Then one of the 8-pounders fired, and that was a small miracle. A surprising number of Clestrus's cavalry had survived the fall of their horses. Well, horses were bigger targets, and they didn't wear breastplates. Having nowhere else to go, they were charging up on foot their lances for pikes. Some of them were shot in front of the abatis. Quite a few were piked trying to get through it. A few did get through. As he galloped to help deal with one party of these, he could see militiamen with scythe-blade things. He had never decided on the correct name for those weapons, and billhooks and axes running forward from the horse lines. At that moment, a trumpet sounded on the right and another on the left, and there were great shouts of "Down Styphon" at both ends, Hamacross and the cavalry. Then he was in front of a dozen Nostori mercenaries, pulling up his horse and aiming a pistol at them. "Yield, comrades, we spare mercenaries." An undecided second and a half, then one raised his reversed musketoon over his head. "We yield. Oath to Galzar." That they would keep. Galzar didn't like oath-breaking soldiers. He always let them get killed at the next opportunity. Memo. Cult of Galzar? Encourage. Some peasants ran up brandishing axes. He waved them back. "Keep your weapons," he told the mercenaries. "I'll find somebody to guard you." He found a couple of mobile force arquebusiers, and then had to save a couple more mercenaries from having their throats cut. Damn these civilians! Have to detail prisoner guards. Disarm the mercenaries, and the peasants would butcher them. Leave them armed in the rear, and maybe the temptation would be too great, even for the fear of Galzar. Along the abatis, the firing had stopped, but the hollow below was a perfect hell's bedlam, "Down Styphon," and occasionally Gormoth, pistol shots clashing steel. Over his shoulder he could see villagers, even women and children, replacing the militia at the horse lines. Captains were shouting, "Pikes forward," and pikemen were dodging out among the felled trees. Dimly, through the smoke, he saw red and blue colours on horsemen at the brow of the opposite hill. The road had been left open. He trotted forward and down toward the brook. What he saw in the hollow made his stomach heave. After being dinghy-mobbed on the west coast, he had made a side trip into Mexico on the way home and seen a bullfight in Juarez. One horse gored to death by a bull hadn't bothered him much, but this would have sickened the most hardened aficionado. The infantrymen going forward were stopping to brain wounded horses or cut their throats or shoot them with pistols from saddle holsters. They oughtn't to stop to do that, but he couldn't blame them. The Hostigi soldier was a farmer and couldn't let horses suffer. Stretcher-bearers were coming forward too, and so were villagers to loot. Corpse robbing was the only way the civil population here and now had of getting some of their own back after a battle. Most of them had clubs or hatchets to make sure that what they were robbing really were corpses. A lot of good weapons lying around, too. They ought to be collected before they rusted into uselessness, but no time to do that now. Stopping to do that once had been one of Stonewall Jackson's few mistakes. Away ahead there was another uproar of battle and more down Styphon. That would be the 200 cavalry from the far right hitting the second batch of mercenaries who would be disorganized by now by fugitives from the fight at the Hollow. Gormoth wasn't going to have to pay a lot of mercenaries if this kept up. The infantry were beginning to form up on the opposite hill, blocks of pikemen with smaller blocks of arquebusiers between, and some were running back to fetch the horses, and Nostori cavalry were coming in small groups, holding their helmets up on their sword points and crying, "We yield! Oath to Galzar!" One of the officers of the flanking party, with 4 men, was bringing in close to 100 of them. He was regretful that so many had escaped. The riflemen on the bench were drifting east, firing as they went. All the infantry from the Athen and many of the militia had mounted themselves on captured horses. There was a clatter behind him, and he got his horse off the road to let the 4-pounders pass in column. Their captain waved to him and told him, laughing, that the 8s would be along in a day or so. "Where do we get some more shooting?" he asked. "Down the road a piece. Just follow along. We'll show you." He looked at his watch. It was still 10 minutes till noon, Hostego's standard sundial time. By 1700 they were well down the road, and there had been a lot of shooting on the way. Now they were 2 miles west of the Athen, where Clestrus's wagons and cannon were strung out for half a mile each way along the road, and he was sitting with his helmet off on an upended wine keg at a table made by laying a shed door across a couple of boxes, with Harmacross's pyrographed doeskin map spread in front of him and a mug where he could reach it. There were some burned-out farm buildings beside the road, and the big oaks which shaded him had been yellowed on one side by the heat. Several hundred prisoners were squatting in the field beyond, eating food from their own wagons. Harmacross and the chief captain of mounted infantry, he'd be about 2-star rank, and the major equivalent Galzar chaplain and the brigadier in direct command of the cavalry sat or squatted around him. The messenger from Seven Hills Valley, who had just caught up with him, was trying to walk the stiffness out of his legs, carrying a mug from which he drank as he paced and talked. "That's all we know," he said. "All morning there was cannon fire up the river, and then small arms fire. A lot of it. And when the wind was right, we could hear shouting. A little after noon, some cavalry who had been patrolling the strip between the river and the mountain came in. They said Netzigun was across in force in front of Vrielos Gap, and they couldn't get through to Tosfes and Princess Rilla." He cursed. Some of it was comprehensible in local cursing terms. "Is she at Vrielos too?" Harmacross laughed. "You ought to know her by now, Kalvan. Try and keep that girl out of a battle." He'd probably be doing that the rest of his life. Or hers, which mightn't be so long if she wasn't careful. The messenger stopped, taking a deep drink, then continued. "Finally, a rider came in from this side of the mountain. He said that the Nostori were over the river and pushing Prince Tosfes back into the gap. He wanted to know if the captain at Tardombra could help him. Well, we only had 200 regulars and 250 militia, and it's 10 miles up to Vrielos along the river, and the Styphon's own way around the mountains on the south side. so the captain left a few cripples and kitchen women to hold the castle and took everything else he had across the river. They were just starting when he sent me off. I heard cannon fire when I was crossing Seven Hills Valley. That was about the best thing he could do. There'd be a couple of hundred Nostori at Dissa, about Jersey Shore, just a holding force. If they could run them out, burn the town, and start enough of a scare, it might take some of the weight off Ptosphis at Vrilos and Chartiphon at Lystra mouth. "I hope nobody expects any help from us," Harmacross said. "Our horses are ridden into the ground. Half our men are mounted on captured horses. They're in worse shape now than the ones of our own we have left. Some of my men are riding too on a horse," Frames, the mounted infantry CO, said. "You figure what kind of a march they can make." "It would be midnight before any of us could get to Vrilos Gap," he said. "That would be less than 1,000. 500, I'd call it," the cavalry brigadier said. "We've been losing by attrition all the way east. But I'd heard that your losses had been very light." "You heard? From whom?" "Why, from the men guarding prisoners. Great Dralm, Lord Kalvan, I never saw so many. That's our losses, prisoner guard details, everyone as much out of it as though he'd been shot through the head." But Clestra's army had simply ceased to exist. It was not improbable that as many as 500 had safely crossed the Ethan at Marak's Ford. There would be several hundred more, singly and in small bands, dodging through the woods to the south, and some 600 had broken through at Naza Gap. The rest had either been killed or captured. First, there had been the helter-skelter chase east from Fitra. For instance, 25 riflemen, firing from behind trees and rocks, had stopped and turned back 200 cavalry who were making for the next gap down. Mostly, anybody who was overtaken held up an empty hand or a reversed sword and invoked Galzar. He only had to fight once himself. He and 2 mobile force cavalrymen caught up with 10 fleeing mercenaries and charged them, shouting to them to yield. Maybe the 10 were tired of running, maybe they thought it was insulting for 3 men to try to capture them, or maybe they were just contrary. Instead, they had turned and charged. He had half dodged and half parried a lance and spitted the lancer through the throat, and had been thrusting and parrying with 2 swordsmen when a dozen mounted infantrymen came up. Then they had fought a small battle half a mile west of Sistros. 1,500 infantry and 500 cavalry, all mercenaries, had just returned to the main road after passing around both sides of the burning town, and were forming up when the wrecks of the cavalry from Fitra had come pelting into them. Their own cavalry and the fugitives were trying to force a way of escape, and the infantry were trying to pike them off when the hostigi arrived, mounted infantrymen dismounting to fight on foot. Then the 4-pounders arrived and began throwing case shot, leather tubes full of pistol bullets. Gormoth's mercenaries had never been exposed to case shot before. Several hundred were killed, and the rest promptly hoisted their helmets, tore off Gormoth's colours, and cried for quarter. That had been where the mercenary general Clestras had surrendered. Frames had attended to that. He and Harmacross had kept on with the cavalry, now down to 300, pistoling and cutting down fugitives. A lot of these turned left toward Naza Gap. Hestophiz, the hostigi CO there, about United States captain equivalent, he'd be a full colonel this time tomorrow, had been a real cool cat. He'd had 250 men, mostly regulars with calivers, 2 old 20-pound bombards, and several smaller pieces. Clestras's infantry had attacked Nerfi Gap, the one below him, and with the aid of Netzigon's men from the other side had swamped it. A few survivors had escaped along the mountain top and brought the news to Naza. An hour later, Hestophis' position was under attack from both sides, too. He had beaten off 3 assaults, a probable total of 1,000 men. Then his lookout on the mountain reported seeing the Fitra Sistros fugitives streaming east. Hestophis promptly spiked his guns and pulled his men up out of the gap. The infantry who had been besieging him were swept along with the fleeing cavalry. From the mountainside, Hestophis spattered them with caliver bullets to discourage loitering and let them escape to spread panic on the other side. By now, they would be spreading it in Nostor town. Phytra had been a turkey shoot, Sistros had been a roundup, and the rest of it had been a fox hunt. Then they had run into the guns and wagon train, inching along under ox power. There had been, with the train, 1,000 of Gormoth's own infantry and 500 mercenary cavalry. This had been Sistros all over, but a massacre. The fugitive cavalry had tried to force their way through, the infantry had resisted, and then the 4-pounders, only 5, one was off the road below Sistros with a broken axle, had arrived and begun firing case shot, and then one of the 8-pounders arrived. Some of the mercenaries tried to put up a serious fight. When they found the pay chests in one of the wagons, they understood why. The Nestori infantry simply emptied their calivers and threw them away and ran. Along with down Styphon, the pursuers were now shouting, "Dralm and no quarter!" He wondered what Zentos would have thought of that. Dralm wasn't supposed to be that kind of a god. "You know," he said, getting out his pipe and tobacco, "we didn't have a very big army to start with. Just what do we have now?" 500 here and 400 at the river, Frames said. The rest are guarding prisoners all the way back to Phytra. "Well, I think we can help Tosphes and Chartiphon best from here," he said. "That gang Hestophes let through at Naza will be panting out their story all the way to Nostor town." He looked at his watch again. If he ever broke that thing, he'd be sunk. By this time, Gormoth will be getting ready to fight the Battle of Nostor. He turned to Frames. "How many men do you absolutely need here?" he asked. 200. Frames looked up and down the road and at the prisoners in the field, and then, out of the corner of his eye, at the boxes under the shed door that formed the tabletop. They hadn't got around to weighing all that silver yet, but there was too much to be careless with. "I ought to have twice that many, Lord Kalvan. The prisoners are mercenaries, and they have agreed to take Prince Tosphes' colours," the priest of Galzar said. "Of course, they cannot bear arms against Gormoth or against any in his service until released from their oaths to him by the end of the war. In the sight of the war god, helping you to guard these wagons would be bearing arms against Gormoth, for it would free your own soldiers to do so. But I will speak to them, and I will answer that they will not break the surrender. You will need no guards for them." 200, then, Frames said. "I can use walking wounded for some things."